You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 443 of the podcast. And in this one, I chat with Will, who has kindly agreed to share his OCD story with us. And in particular, we talk about harm-themed OCD, OCD that latched onto someone, medication, the OCD theme of worrying whether he has OCD or not, tics, what helps him, and much, much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers effective and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. Thank you to all of our patrons for supporting our work. To sign up to our Patreon and to check out the other benefits you'll receive as a patron, please see the link in the show notes. So thank you to Will for his time and sharing his story. I deeply appreciate it. And of course, thank you to you guys, as always, for listening. It means a lot. Without further ado, here is Will. Welcome to the podcast, Will.
Thank you for having me, Stuart.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. I've been on yours, is it 3 times or 2 times?
You've been on Lively Minds 3 times now, and they've all been really fascinating conversations.
Thank you.
Yeah. And it's a real pleasure to be on OCD Stories podcast. I listen to it a lot, and yeah, I mean, when I first started listening to it, it really was a moment of, oh my word, you know, there's actually other people out there that experience these things too, and it's just really helped a great deal.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'm now realizing, obviously, we both published the episode we did with Matthew from the ISDF I published on my feed as well, so people would have heard your voice through that.
Yes.
Yeah, so, you know, we're here, though, today for your OCD story. So, yeah, you can share that now, as little as much detail as you want to give.
Thank you. So I think before I share my OCD story, I would just like to very briefly share the story of how I came to understand my OCD story, because like for so many people with OCD, I didn't know I had it for a very, very long time. So I think with hindsight, I'm now pretty sure that I developed OCD about 30 years ago. But it's only about in the last 10 years that I've realized it was OCD. And I realized that's, as I say, a very common story that people tell. I think Matt said, if I remember rightly, it can be around 14 years, I think, from onset of symptoms to diagnosis for a lot of people, if they get diagnosed at all. And also, you know, I'm 43 years old, so it all started kicking off for me in my teens, which is the sort of mid-90s. And I think back then, you know, understanding about OCD was, it was really not anywhere near as good as it is today, even though I realize that today there's still a lot of misunderstanding about it. Because no matter, you know, all the healthcare professionals I went to, and there was lots of them, none of them picked up it was OCD. Although, as you're about to hear, it manifests itself in a slightly unusual way. So maybe maybe they can be slightly forgiven for that. But about 10 years ago, I was reading an article about OCD, and you will not be surprised to hear that the article was written by Rose Cartwright. It was just before she wrote her book Pure, before the Channel 4 series. And the article was about this thing called Pure O. And putting aside for a moment the ongoing debate about the term Puro, which you've been on our podcast to talk about as well. I think what was really potent about the article was the way in which it made me realize that, yes, obsessions can be intrusive thoughts about, you know, whether something is contaminated, but they can also be about all sorts of other things as well. And whilst compulsions certainly can be externalized behaviors like endless cleaning, hand washing, there are actually compulsions that can include all sorts of different behaviors, and can exist in the mind as well. And at that point, I had very little understanding of OCD, full stop. Like most people, I caught references to it in the media and thought it was something to do with people needing to clean all the time or turning light switches on and off and all that kind of thing. And of course, the portrayals of OCD at the time that focused on contamination OCD were in themselves like gross misrepresentations of OCD, and of course still are to a large extent. But I think that sort of reading this article and learning about mental compulsions in OCD was a real turning point for me, because suddenly so much of my experiences over the past sort of 20 years or so started to make sense in a new way. So what follows is what I remember from the article, but also with my own interpretation. So I want to be careful to say this is not what Rose wrote in the article. It's some of it is, but it's also like I found myself kind of running away with the interpretation of it myself. So whilst what the article talks about isn't something I directly relate to, the mechanisms involved, the processes involved were just, that was the thing that was the light bulb moment for me. It was just seeing that OCD mechanism play out that was really incredible, actually, an incredible moment for me. And so, yeah, in the article, the example given is about a boy who is terrified that he might want to have sex with his sister. So he's having these intrusive thoughts about committing incest with his sister. They are unwanted. He tries to not think of them. But of course, the more you try and not think of them, the more you think of them. I believe it. I think I looked it up. I think it's called ironic process theory, from what I could tell from what I looked up. The more you try not think about something, the more you're likely to think about it. Like the Christopher Nolan film Inception, where they say, "Don't think about elephants. What are you thinking about? Elephants." So his mind becomes flooded with these thoughts, these unwanted thoughts, and then suddenly, with like a feeling of horrifying panic in the pit of his stomach, he thinks to himself, "Did I just get turned on by that thought?" And this takes things to a whole new level, because what would it say to him about him, I should say, if he was turned on by the thought of having sex with his sister? And yet, of course, spoiler alert, he doesn't want to have sex with his sister at all. He's experiencing OCD, the doubting disorder. And it's the disorder that will latch onto any fears that you might have about who you might be, who you might become, and it tries to sort of ram those fears down your throat. And these intrusive thoughts don't represent any kind of hidden desire; they represent hidden fears. And I know that I'm going over, in a sense, I feel like I'm going over a bit of old ground, because I know that on your podcast, this is a message that you repeat constantly. I know that the vast majority of your listeners will know this better than me, but I do feel there's still a lot of misunderstanding out there about this. And the media still pushes those stereotypes and disinformation about all sorts of OCD subtypes, as we talked about with Matthew on the Lively Minds podcast, about misconceptions and misinformation about OCD. And so so I always feel the need to sort of say it. I always feel the need to sort of like clarify it, especially around the taboo stuff. I think the taboo stuff, taboo themed OCD stuff, there's still a huge amount of misunderstanding. People still think that there's some kind of hidden urges, hidden desires in there, which of course is complete nonsense. And so everything up until this guy who is worried about wanting to have sex with his sister, everything up until that point, in terms of the sort of the intrusive thoughts in his head is of course what in OCD we would call the obsession. And I have to say, I'm not a massive fan of the term OCD, of the term obsessive compulsive disorder, because for me, obsession suggests an experience that somebody wants to have, no matter how misguided. Whereas for the OCD sufferer, of course, the opposite is true. It's quite literally the last thing you want to be thinking. And so whilst I realise that's not the intention behind the word, and I'm not suggesting that we sort of start a campaign, Stuart, to change of change the name of obsessive compulsive disorder. It does sit the word obsession in obsessive compulsive disorder doesn't sit quite right with me. And then, of course, this guy moves on to the compulsion part of OCD, and again, a lot of misunderstanding surrounds that word, because I think there's an idea out there that compulsions mean being compelled to act out hidden urges that, of course, we've established don't exist. Nothing that could be further from the truth. So yeah. And then there's a bit in the article that I remember. I don't hear it talked about very much around compulsions, and this is something that really connected with me, which is this idea that you, as part of the compulsion, and especially within the sort of pure mental compulsion side of things, you start to set yourself mental tests, which means that he's actually having to purposefully bring up the notion or the idea of having intercourse with a sister, and then test himself, test his response to that, and to make sure that what he feels is revulsion and repulsion at that, and only when he's confident that he feels adequately repulsed by that can he get on with his day, as it were. But then, of course, he can't get on with his day because the thoughts still keep on coming back, and so, yeah, like I say, whilst it was something I didn't identify with directly, the mechanisms in there were very identifiable. So that's enough about the context, I can say. I mean, so my OCD story. I mean, I think it started probably when I was very, very little. So let's go back to like when I was a kid. I moved to Newcastle, where I live now in northeast England, at the age of 5. My dad became the vicar, the Church of England minister for an area of Newcastle called Arthur's Hill, which was a very disadvantaged area of Newcastle. A lot of crime, a lot of antisocial behaviour, and yet it was an incredibly warm and spirited place. And it was really the happiest days of my life, to be honest. The local church was a really solid community, and the community as a whole really looked out for each other. It was, that real sense of community spirit, which was great. So I went to church as a kid. My dad was the vicar for the local church. My parents weren't at the time, and still aren't, at all dogmatic in their Christian faith. I'd say that they're both very much on the liberal wing of Christianity, and yet I think that my tendency towards OCD did start to latch onto some of the stuff that was being said week in, week out at church. And what was being said was really just sort of standard Church of England liturgy, so pretty mainstream stuff. But there's still an awful lot of talk of sin in there. And looking back at the order of service, I looked back at it just a few weeks ago for the first time in decades, pretty much. And some of the bits you say out loud, together, things like, we are not worthy so much as to gather up the crumbs from under your table. Another one, we confess we have sinned in thought and word and deed. So thought, we have sinned in thought. And so for a young boy whose mind is prone to wander to all sorts of places, the idea that I'm being judged not just for words and deeds, but for my thoughts as well. I thought that I imagine that's something I'm going to notice at that age. I don't know for sure to what extent it really played a part in the early development of my OCD, but I can totally imagine it doing so. And I realize there's going to be lots of Christians listening to this right now who are saying, but there's lots in there about in the order of service about forgiveness and about hope and about love, and there is, and I'm not saying there isn't at all. And like I say, I don't particularly remember being troubled by what we said in church. I just wonder to what extent saying those words week in, week out might have impacted the sort of developing brain of a young kid.
Yeah.
Um, so with hindsight, I do look at that moment now and think, or those years, and think, was that the beginning? Um, and um, and also I realize that there's a big debate about, well, across the whole of mental health, sometimes a raging debate about to what extent mental health is to do with biomedical stuff and to what extent it's to do with environmental stuff. And I'm quite centrist about that, really.
Mm.
I think that I probably had a propensity for OCD. Four members of my immediate family have OCD. And
Mm.
it just feels like a bit too much of a coincidence to me that.
Yeah.
But So I had my first spike in my early teens, and it was that I worried that I wanted a relative to die, um, and that's when the mental tests came in, and
Mm.
which is why the aforementioned article was really powerful for me. And So I had to set tests to sort of think of this relative dying and checking that I felt sad and felt
Mm.
upset by it and not sort of gleeful. I mean, why I would feel that anyway, of course, is anyone's
Yeah.
guess. But and so that's the first spike that I remember. I remember specifically. I think we might have even been in the car on the way to see that relative at the time. I've got a memory of looking out of a car window, and so yeah. So my OCD kind of continued from there. But I want to jump forward now, really, to my late teens, where I had like this, I guess you could say, sort of spike of spikes that in to my memory sort of feels like it lasted a good couple of years.
Mm.
Of course, it would have had ups and downs over that time, but it seemed like pretty full on. Um, and it perhaps presented itself in an unusual way. I don't know. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But in my late teens, I became infatuated with somebody,
Mhm.
and this person filled my mind night and day.
Mm.
And at first it was nice, but then quite randomly one night, as I was lying in bed, the thought of this person being harmed flashed through my head. And then, and I can't remember if it was soon after or a little later on, a fear suddenly descended on me, which was, what if there are like aliens, evil aliens who can see my thoughts?
Mm.
And what if they can see these thoughts of the person being harmed and sort of consider them as instructions to come to
Mm.
Earth and actually do these awful things to them? Um, and it feels a bit random, although it feels a bit less random when you consider that I had also just recently become an atheist. And I've had conversations with people since who've said that it sounds like the aliens kind of became a proxy for God, the
Mm.
devil, good and evil, and I'm sure there is some truth in that. Um, so I was worrying that I was transmitting these thoughts to aliens who would sort of descend upon the earth to carry out these awful acts. So I had to counter this compulsion, obviously. And so I would imagine the word no in my mind to tell them not to come. Um, and with that, I just tried to put it out of my mind. But of course, I can't, because the more I try and not think about it, the more I think about it. Um, and so it's not long before the thoughts return again, and I'm having to think of the word no in my mind again to counter these thoughts.
Mm.
But then it starts to get into like areas of real absurdity, because then I start to think to myself, well, hang on a second, these aliens, they're not going to understand English, are they? So the word no is going to mean nothing to them.
Mm.
um, so it kind of just became this really weird sort of absurdist sort of problem solving of trying to get these aliens to understand that I don't want them to come to Earth to carry out these acts. So I started thinking about sad faces and shaking heads, and
Mm.
I remember ticks and crosses, like and sort of in my mind honing towards the cross. And actually, I also like wrote on bits of paper, like I'd draw a cross on a bit of paper and have that by my bedside. Usually, when I was sort of in bed going to sleep, I'd
Mm.
think these things just so I could look at it, to sort of say no to the
Mm.
aliens. Which reminds me of the conversation we had about Puro and how you were saying that Puro nearly always has some kind of physical compulsion attached to it as
Yeah.
well, and it made me think of that. Um, and and it became a bit fever pitch, really. So I go and see my doctor, and he refers me to a psychiatrist, and they briefly think it's some form of psychosis. Um, but in the end, they think it's probably not psychosis. And I think, because I knew that what I was doing was irrational, I could sort of rationalize
Mm.
it quite easily, and I kind of knew that there weren't really aliens out there, but I just couldn't stop myself from doing having to carry out the compulsions in response to these worries.
Mm.
Um, and it remained pretty intense between the ages of 16 and 18. And the theories sort of get wilder and wilder as part of the problem solving, as part of the attempts to nullify these worries, these intrusive thoughts. The problem solving has to just get more and more ridiculous. So, for
Mm.
example, on the one hand, I think, oh well, it's unlikely that there'll be evil aliens that are close enough to Earth that they'll be able to read my mind. And then on the other hand, I sort of think, well, if the universe is infinite, and then if therefore technological potential is infinite, then there must be some aliens out there somewhere that can read my thoughts, and
Mm.
and then I remember another one was going back to the good and God and the devil, good and evil again. It was like, oh, if the universe is infinite, and if there are if that means that they're guaranteed to be an evil alien force out there who can read your mind and who can get to Earth in the time to be able to carry out these things, then that must mean that there are equally good aliens out there who are going to come and they're going to thwart the evil aliens. And so this whole thing was just playing out in
Mm.
my mind. This all these space battles almost. It was quite. I mean, made quite a good science fiction program, I imagine,
Mm.
science fiction show. Um, but it just became like completely and utterly just not absorbing. Just completely
Mm.
engulfed me really for those
Yeah.
2 years. Um, and yeah, I still wonder whether the aliens element did throw a bit of a curveball in there, I guess. Which is why I kind of don't feel too mad at the doctors and medics for not maybe
Mm.
gauging that it was probably OCD.
Yeah.
Um, and so, after that calmed down, sort of in my early 20s, I would say that the OCD stuck around, but it gave way to much more generalized anxiety, really, from my early 20s onwards.
Mm.
Um, and um, if anything, I would say that my current OCD, 'cause I'm now medicated, which I have found has been a really good way of managing my OCD. And again, I'm not saying that's what everyone should do. It's different for different people, but it's
Mm.
worked for me. And if anything, I would say that nowadays um, my OCD sort of theme is whether or not I have OCD, more
Mm.
broadly speaking, whether I even have any mental health problems at all, or whether I'm just
Yeah.
I keep on telling myself I'm attention seeking, and just being whatever, just it's just a lot of self attacking that happens, and
Mm.
so I'm finding myself compulsions wise quite often. It wasn't all that long ago that I was just doing loads of those online test things.
Hmm.
Sort of,
Yeah.
do you have OCD? And as I'm compulsively doing these OCD tests, I'm thinking, oh, the irony.
Mm.
Um, but um, but yeah, and um, yeah. So I've also sort of thought. So yeah. So a lot of the stuff rotates around. A lot of the stuff now rotates around this question of whether or not I have OCD.
Mm.
So I'm continually kind of trying to call myself out as a fraud who just does this for attention, like I say, or and so I find myself, ruminating about it endlessly, and just doing so much research, so much reading into it, um, that it's kind of, it's which I don't think is necessarily always that healthy. Um, um, as somebody who until very recently relatively recently, would have said anxiety with a little bit of OCD, and now probably would describe the
Mm.
other way around, OCD with a bit of anxiety. or maybe a bit of both. I'm also have been really interested about the relationship between anxiety and OCD. And I was really pleased to hear Ben Eckstein on your podcast.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, what you said that I really liked was, and I hope I'm paraphrasing him correctly here, but basically he seemed to be saying like we shouldn't get too hung up on the difference.
Mhm.
That they're sort of two different parts of the same continuum, and I think that there's a lot of truth in that for me, because I think insofar as anxiety starts with a worry,
Yeah.
we could call that an intrusive thought, I think. Um, and then that would lead on to rumination, which I think, we could call a compulsion, that masquerades as, problem solving. That cycle that you can get into, for me, has a really distinct feeling of
Mhm.
OCD. Um, if it isn't OCD, then it's got a very similar mechanic to OCD. Um, and I also remember somebody else on your podcast talking about, and I can't remember who on earth it was, and I don't even know if they were talking about this in a positive sense or a negative sense, but they used the term rehearsed mantras of OCD.
Can't
Um,
remember that.
I just remember that term,
Mm.
and that whether this was what they intended at all or not,
Mhm.
the way it kind of spoke to me was it kind of reminded me of how when I get really anxious about something, it's literally like a script in my head that the compulsion part, if we can call it that, because as I say,
Mhm.
who knows if this is really OCD or not, or whether it's anxiety. The compulsion part is almost like a rehearsed script to try and allay
Mhm.
those worries, and it almost becomes a word for word kind of like
Yeah.
mantra. I remember that really, yeah, that really speaking to me as well
Yeah.
as an OCD feel. Um, but yeah, so when I have tried, yeah, so well, I mean, I think, I guess, and I realize this is something that maybe you will want to speak to at some point. I don't know, but
Mm.
where there is a difference, I guess, is in the treatment options, and that's something that I find really interesting as well. So obviously, I've read on the IOCDF website that standard CBT cannot be
Mm.
very effective or even do more harm than good for OCD, whereas specialist CBT such as ERP, ACT
Mm.
are sort of the gold standards.
Mm.
Um, uh, and so I do find that kind of thing around the distinction quite interesting. Although, as I say, I would fully admit that my slight kind of my interest in air quotes might in itself just be me kind of trying to prove to myself that I've got OCD. um, but yeah, but yeah. So the last bit really for me is just talking little bit about what I call the long shadow of OCD, because
Mm.
I don't know how it compares to other people who share their stories, but obviously I'm in my mid 40s now, and so it's been around for quite a long time. And something that there's certain things that I've noticed that I just sort of wonder whether they're part and parcel of my OCD. And again, reading about it, I see that there possibly is some truth to it. So, for example, I have tics, and
Mm.
the big difference between, I guess, my tics and the tics of somebody who might have Tourette's, for example, is that I have control over my tics. So um, I can make sure I only do them when I'm alone. And quite often it just means uttering a random word or a random phrase, but that becomes that becomes a phrase of the month or something, which will
Mm.
just be the thing that I randomly kind of say. And so, talk to me is a really common one, for
Yeah.
example. For a while, it was death, which was a little bit sad. Not exactly the most encouraging uh, uh, tick to have, but and I think that in itself, I noticed that I do it when I'm feeling anxious, and it's almost like that
Mm.
kind of, one could say, I guess, a compulsive kind of
Mhm.
response to that anxiety to try and manage it and to try and kind of settle it a little bit. Um, Stimming is something else that I do,
Yeah.
and again, so obviously, I mean, in my day job, I work a lot with disabled and neurodivergent people and autistic people, and I know that in the autistic community, stimming is broadly speaking, considered quite a positive thing. For me personally, it's not particularly positive. It's the pacing when worrying, pacing when going through maybe a compulsion, a mental compulsion. There's that kind of pacing backwards and forwards that I do in an attempt to sort of manage the worry. But again, I have full control over when I do that as well. So, which again is a yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think that there is this kind of I think there is this um as I say, this kind of these remnants of OCD that kind of remain with me, even though I guess it's debatable to what extent nowadays, especially with the medication, to what extent I actually have OCD or still have OCD. And the other thing as well that I find very helpful is trying to laugh about my OCD as well. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think that's probably my OCD story, I think.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And thank you for sharing like what's helping you and going back to when you had the is the worry intrusive thought around someone dying and then checking of how do I feel? Am I sad? Am I, whatever. And then it went on to the person you were obsessing about. And it was then the aliens of, yeah, am I going to send a message that's going to hurt them? And because you said that one was 16 to 18, with
Mm.
both of those themes, what was there anything that you think changed or happened that made you switch or like the OCD or worry latch onto something else? Or did it just naturally kind of happen, do you think?
I think that the switch to the aliens stuff was very much linked around me becoming an atheist. I think that
Oh, okay.
um, I think the aliens became a proxy for God at that point,
Mm,
and I think that I so I think that it was they were sort of essentially a replacement for God in the sense that if I'm gonna, what was that thing I mentioned earlier? Sin in thought and word and deed.
mm,
So, if I'm going to sin in thought, if there's no God to listen to those and judge those thoughts, then there's some replacement that comes in to judge those thoughts.
mm.
So I think that might have been a key thing there.
Yeah.
Um, in terms of the relative dying thing, I can't remember. That was when I was very young indeed.
Okay.
So I can't really remember on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. How have you how has OCD like showed up for you in your work, or does it interfere in that way over the years, and how have you managed that?
Yeah. So this is where it gets quite interesting for me because my day job is that I run a production company that supports disabled and neurodivergent filmmakers. We're UK wide, but we mainly focus on supporting people in the Northeast. And um, so through that, we very much operate using something called the social model of disability. And
Mm,
what this sort of says is that people who have disabilities, which can include mental health conditions, rather than thinking of it as a problem with them, a problem with their functionality, to actually think about it the other way around and think about it more as a problem with society, environments, workplaces,
mm,
not being accommodating for people who have those challenges. Um, and importantly, for me personally, that doesn't in any way negate the fact that um, mental health problems, other health conditions bring with them like an inherent pain or inherent difficulties. But
mm,
it's more saying that that there is a responsibility that society has in terms of being able to help alleviate that and help you fit in as much as possible. So, with that in mind, um, I do try and operate that way myself. So I find that I'm able to manage because I'm very senior within the organization concerned. I am able to
mm.
manage my own diary, make sure I don't have too many uh, events or meetings happening, kind of back to back or in quick succession, which I know would cause me a lot of anxiety. Um, and um, and
Mm.
I completely recognize that I'm really privileged in that situation, and that there's lots of people listening to this right now who might have very similar diagnoses to me, but who are are not in a position to be able to do that because they haven't got the same autonomy in their lives, and that's
Mm.
a problem. And so I do recognize that, I'm very lucky to be able to do that. I think that there is an increasing movement to try and bring about change within organizations around their working practices. And I think that if we take OCD as an example, it's just more generically take OCD as an example. Um, for example, correct me if I'm wrong here, Stu, but within ACT, there's the dropping anchor exercise, I
Yeah,
believe. I watched
correct.
a few videos of your colleague Johnny going through a few
Yeah.
things on his YouTube video channel, and it could well be that for somebody with OCD, a reasonable adjustment, which is the lingo for adjustments made in work to support somebody who needs those adjustments as per social model, might be that they can take some time out of the office, for example. There might be a quiet space that's available
Mhm.
for people, and they can go in there to do their drop anchor exercise or to just have a moment. If it's
Yeah.
nothing to do, I may have nothing to do with that, but it may just be that they want to have a moment
Yeah.
outside of the office where they can just sort of calm down and sort of
Mm.
try to sort of reduce their anxiety. So these are sort of things that I think organizations can do to make stuff easier for people who have a
Mm.
whole range of conditions, including mental health conditions and including, for that matter, OCD as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. Um, yeah. And your family, do they know about your experiences now? Have you shared it with them?
Yeah, I've become quite open about it, but only really generally open about my mental health within the past sort of 7 or 8 years, I would say. Um,
Mm.
so starting the podcast, Lively Minds, was a big thing for me. Doing it
Yeah.
with the wonderful Ellie Page, my
Mm.
co-host. But it's also obviously quite a revealing thing as well. And my family do know about it. I had a conversation with my mum and dad before coming on here, actually, just to sort of
Okay.
make it clear to them that that even though could well be my Christian upbringing to a certain degree that may have started triggering the OCD. To be quite honest, if it hadn't been that, I think it could have been something else quite
Yeah,
easily
sure.
that it latched onto. And like I
Yeah.
say, they were the most liberal, still are the most liberal, non-doctrinarial, is that a word? Sort of
Probably.
Christians that I know, really.
Yeah.
It's a word now.
Yeah.
Um, so people are quite aware
Mm.
of it. I'm also very close. As I say, I mentioned before that there's 4 family members that I know of who
Yeah.
have OCD, and I found that that's a really been a very powerful way of bonding with
Mm.
them and finding finding some mutual support as well around it. Um, so that's really important too. And uh, I'm really interested by the sort of identity that's building around OCD as well,
Mm.
and that being used as a tool for advocacy. And when Matt on from the IOCDF was talking about our community, I was very aware they kept saying our community,
Mm.
and that was really powerful because you start thinking, yeah, okay, so along with that comes identity, solidarity,
Yeah.
and the potential to actually bring about positive change as well.
That's true. Yeah, it is a really good community. Yeah, I've heard other people say that from other communities that when they dip their toe in the OCD world, they're really shocked and surprised at how close knit and friendly and active the community is. Um, and what else do you do that helps you maintain your sort of mental well-being?
Exercise is really important for me,
Yeah.
and um, it's I don't I just walk. It's not running or anything. I'm
Hmm.
very lucky in that where I live in Newcastle, I'm very close to what's called the Dean, and it's just a nice long valley with a river.
Sure.
And so I can go up and down there every so often. And I really feel it if I haven't been out for my daily walk. So that's
Mhm.
important for me. Um, and I think that also just trying to make sure that the work-life balance is
Mm.
managed as much as possible. I think that's one of the downsides of running your own organization and then being also a freelancer and at other times like I am, as I'm sure many people who are in a similar situation listening will identify with.
Yeah.
The work-life balance can be really, really hard. So I think that finding ways of being able to manage that is really, really important, and that's something else
Mm.
that at the organisation I'm part of, we're trying to do more and more work around, helping not just the senior management, but also everybody within the organisation to actually
Mm.
be able to manage that, because I
Yeah.
think that can be such a major thing for anybody. Like we hear people talking about burnout. People are expecting more for less across all sectors,
Mm.
and I think that that is just not conducive at all for any kind of positive mental health
No.
on any level whatsoever. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. And just words of hope for anyone listening. What would you tell them?
I would say, I think I would probably say, first and foremost, it's not your fault.
Mm.
I think that there's so much self-blame around. And again, not everybody, but certainly for me, especially in my formative years, in my kind of teens, early 20s, there was just a lot of self-blame. And I think that um, here it's it's about getting the balance right between not feeling like you're powerless to be able to not do anything about it, i.e.,
Mm.
it being your OCD, um, because you can. And as you've spoken about so many times on this podcast with other people, that's
Mm.
demonstrably true that you can do something about it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, perhaps when you do feel like it's spiraling a bit and you're struggling to keep on top of it, is the very last thing you should be doing in that moment is having a go at yourself.
Mm.
And I think certainly for me personally, that was often something that would happen, is that in amongst that spiral, I would just be starting to really have a go at myself because it was all my fault, wasn't it? Because all this, I brought this on myself. I brought this all on myself, and it's like
Mm.
you've just got to stop and not let yourself go down that rabbit hole, because it's just not true at all. This is this thing, and whether it's been developed through environmental, mainly environmental factors,
Mm.
or whether it's developed through more of a biomedical approach, depending on your angle, doesn't really matter. At the end of
Yeah.
the day, what you've got is this thing called OCD. It's a thing that you know that you're experiencing, and that's what it is. It's not to do with it's about trying to reduce the self blame. At the end of the day, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah. 100%. 100%. And forget my questions. Uh, pick up the phone and call the 20-year-old Will. What'd you tell him?
I think I'll probably just tell him he's got OCD.
Yeah.
I think he'd be quite surprised at that.
Yeah.
It would save quite a lot of. It would save what 15 years of just like not having a clue what he was doing, not having a clue what was going on.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think there's that. I think
Mhm.
um, yeah, I think that's probably the main thing I'd say.
Yeah. 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 Well, it's an important message.
Mm.
And yeah, you got a billboard in Newcastle. What do you want written on that billboard?
Well, you know what I'm going to do here, Stu. I'm actually going to nick what you said on one of the Lively Minds episodes, because I said to you that I really liked what one of your previous guests said in response to this. Anxiety, Josh.
Yeah.
He said, "You are not your horrible thoughts."
Mhm.
And I think you said, well, actually, you kind of not your thoughts, right?
Can't remember. Probably.
That's what I think you
Yeah.
said. Well, you're not really.
Yeah.
You didn't say that to him. You said that when I said to you, this is getting very
Yeah.
complicated, isn't it? When I
That's
said
all
to
right.
you that what he said, you said,
Yeah.
"Oh, you're not really your thoughts, are you?" And
Yeah.
actually, I like that. Can I have that? Do you mind
Of
if I
course you
have that?
can. Yeah.
So I'm going to put that on the billboard. I'll put
Yeah.
at the bottom copyright Stuart Ralph though, so that
Well, it's not my phrase, so I can't copyright that. But um yeah, no, you can have that. My billboard was down south, so we need one up north.
yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So and lastly, just anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
I don't think so. Um, I feel like I've kind of garbled it out quite a bit. I said to you before the episode that I did do quite a lot of prep. Maybe I've over prepped. I don't know. I think because it's quite a big moment for me. This, like, I have thought very long and hard about coming onto the show, about asking if I can come on the show, um, and and I'm really glad that I've done it. Um, at the same time, it's quite a big thing because it's not really something that, although I am starting to share it more and more now, it's something which, I've only really recently started sharing, and um, so yeah, and as um, as people say, if it can help anybody else out there at all,
Mhm.
then great.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. Well, look, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been great to hear it. Obviously, I've met you several times, but I've never heard your story. So it was really, really nice to hear it. And also, you go into detail about, how weird and wacky our OCD thoughts can get and take us on such an existential, esoteric, like
Yeah,
thing. So that's really nice to hear. Sorry, you had to go through it. But it's really nice to hear it on the podcast because I bet there's a ton of people with their thoughts going in those directions and they're probably completely lost by it. So
no problem.
thank you for listening to this week's podcast. And thank you to our Patreons who helped make this episode possible. And if you would like to find out more about Patreon and the rewards and benefits, then there will be a link in the episode description. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.